Okay, today we're going to be painting some foxglove, and I'm really excited to be painting these. It's one of my favorite flowers. So first, I'm just going to wet my paints, and I'm not exactly sure which colors I'm going to use, so I'm just going to be safe and put a little bit of water on all of these. Softening up the paints, it helps so that you can pick up more color. A lot of times I hear people struggle with picking up a lot of color. Their colors just look too light, or they feel like they're really working their brush into the paint and nothing's coming up. It could be that you just need to soften your paint before you start painting. So that's all I'm doing, is putting a little bit of water on each of my paint colors so that it's easier to pick up in a moment. So I have a few purple colors on my palette. And I want something a little more on the fuchsia side. So I'm going to mix quinacridone rose, which is like a brighter pink color, and then a little bit of my French ultramarine. That's going to create a really nice purple color. And then I'm just going to soften that color with a little bit of water. I apologize, the purple's just out of frame. That's why I'm trying to talk you through what I'm doing. Okay. And to start out, I like to start at the bottom of my foxglove and kind of work my way up with the petals first, and then go in and add my greens later. So I'm just going to start, and I'm thinking about an imaginary stem. If it helps you to paint the stem first, go ahead and do that just so that you can see where you're painting. But for me, I like the flowers to be the kind of hero of the painting, and then the stems are secondary to that. So I'm just going to start by painting these little bell shapes. It's almost like a V that I've painted, an upside down V. And then I'm rounding the bottom of that, filling it in. It's like a little triangle, and then just rounding the bottom of that. And I want to make sure that I change up the shape just a little bit with all of these, but that's the general shape that I'm going for. It's kind of like a rounded cone shape. And then on some of these, I'm just going to extend either one side or two sides out from there and make the rounded bottom a little more dramatic. So what I'm doing here is I'm painting the base of my petals, and then I'm going to go back in after this has dried and kind of add the detail to make this look more like a finished foxglove. And I also want to mix up the color a little bit as I go, so I'm either going to add a little bit of quinacridone rose to make it a little more pink, or I'm going to add a little more of my French ultramarine to make it a little bit more blue. So here, I'm kind of painting a circular, like a squiggly shape. Very technical. And then I'm just going to finish off the petal by adding my little triangular shape to the side. Now notice all of my kind of points of the triangles are all kind of coming in toward the center point where the stem is going to be. Now for this one that's pointing more toward the side, you'll notice that I left the edges very roughly. And I did that just by kind of moving my brush back and forth. So don't worry too much about how these squiggles are working together, these kind of squiggled ends, because we'll add another layer and you can kind of clean things up a little bit. Now to soften this color, I'm just rinsing my brush but not rinsing it out all the way. So there's still a little bit of color, but it's softened quite a bit. Now, let me just point out too that toward the bottom here of the foxglove, these petals are pointing more downward, and then as we've moved up, they're kind of fanning upward, and then these up here are pointing more upward. I think I'm going to call this part done and start adding in my stems. Now for my green, I'm mixing permanent green and a little bit of perylene green, and then a little bit of yellow ochre. The yellow ochre is just going to kind of mute the color down a little bit so that it's not so bright. I really want this purple to be what pops on this page. Okay. Now for my stem, I'm going to start below, well below my petals. And then as I come up higher, if the paint is still wet, I'm going to try and avoid it and come back to it in a second, but I just want this stem to kind of continue up through my petals. Oh, and see, I accidentally got that. So I'm just going to grab a dry brush and quickly pick up that paint. Left-handed, very tricky. And then it's going to just continue up. So I've got my main stem. I'm going to wait to connect all of my individual petals, but I'm going to add some leaves and some other little green details. So on Foxglove, toward the top especially, you'll see more green buds because not all of the flowers have quite opened up yet. So I'm just going to add a couple little textural buds right here. And I want to make sure I mix up the color a little bit. This is cadmium yellow. And just mixing up the color a little bit will help add a little bit of depth without having to go crazy on the actual brushwork. Okay, so I'm just going to, I don't want those to be green. So I've just lifted the color by pressing my paper towel onto these. And I'm going to wait for those to completely dry before I try and go back and fix the color. Okay, so this flower looks like it's totally dry. It's kind of hard to tell in my lighting right now, but I'm just going to paint a little bit of a petal on either side and then connect that back to my stem. And then once all of these are dry, I'm going to kind of repeat that process of creating little stems, just so it looks like all of these individual petals are connected. I'm also going to add just a couple of leaves. Okay, so I'm gonna wait for these to dry before I go in and kind of mess with those. So I'm gonna focus on adding some detail to some of these petals that are totally dry. And I'm just gonna go back to that purple color I had before. And then down here, I'm just going to be painting over the top of the bottom. So it looks like this inner part is in a shadow and this part is where the light is. And then I'm just going to repeat that on these other ones. Now here where I've left the inside hollow, I'm going to leave that as is. I'm not going to try and mess with that too much, just because I'm going to be adding even more details here in a minute. But even just adding this little bit of detail just makes this feel even more like a foxglove, which I love. And not all of them are going to have this. I'm kind of paying attention to how they would be facing. This one looks like it's facing away from me, so I'm not going to see the inside of that. I'm also going to go back in and add just a little bit more in some of these empty spaces where I feel like it could use a little bit more. But these are going to be a lot softer. And these look like they're dry enough, so I'm going to go back in and add this pink color right over the top. So it's kind of a process. You kind of have to work in phases here. And I just did the exact same thing that I was trying to avoid last time. If I were to just wait for this to dry, I wouldn't keep having this problem. All right, I'm still waiting for a few things to dry, but I'm going to continue. Because the main parts that are still wet are these parts where I added a little bit more depth. I'm just going to go in and add some more petals here where I can. And now I'm going to use a smaller brush. I've got a size 4 here, but even smaller might be better if you've got a smaller brush. And I'm going to be using, this is my phthalo blue green shade, and I'm mixing that right into my purple that I've already had mixed. This is going to be kind of a deeper purple color. And I'm just going to go in with some little dot details. And I'm just kind of stippling that color right onto my flower. And I'm just kind of focusing this on kind of where the inside of the flower would be. I'm not going to touch these quite yet, just because they're still wet. This little dot detail just helps the viewer know that this is actually a foxglove. And I think I want the rest of these to be even more purple, so I'm adding back in a little bit of that quinacridone rose. And I just want to make sure that that color is dry before I go in and add dots, otherwise it'll just kind of spread out and I won't have the same effect. This one looks dry enough. One way to tell that if it's dry or not is I can see a little bit of shine still, especially here and up here. So I know for sure that those are wet. This was harder to tell and it was mostly dry, but you can see how it's kind of blurred a little bit right here. I should have waited even a little bit longer. So I'm just gonna let this dry a little bit more and then I'll continue to add more details. Now, if your foxglove is taking forever to dry, don't worry, because mine is also taking forever to dry. I think I layered on a little bit too much paint. So I'm just going to move on and finish up with a few little details here. I always love adding just a tiny little detail. Just helps the painting come to life, in my opinion. But this is just a style choice, definitely not required to paint these, but I'm just going in and adding just a sharper detail, especially here where some of these are blending together. Just going in and making sure that that detail is shown.